All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Julia Saracini. I am a research associate with the Acer consulting team who has been putting on these showcase events with Dairy Farmers of Canada in collaboration. And so this is our first event of about 15 to 20 seminar events that we'll be doing between now and March. So we're really excited to have you all with us today. Just a few housekeeping things to be mindful of. As a reminder, this meeting is being held as a traditional Zoom meeting, so you'll be able to turn your cameras on and your microphones to ask questions and engage. We'll have a question and answer period towards the end. But in the meantime, if you're not asking questions or if you're not part of the conversation, we just ask that you keep yourselves muted to allow us to hear the speakers most clearly. If you'd like for a better viewing experience, there's an option to switch your viewing to the presenter view, so you can see just the individuals who are speaking with everyone else in the meeting and a smaller view. So we find that that's a little bit easier for viewing if you've never done that before as well. And so we'll have a few opportunities to have everybody introduced here as well with a question and answer period towards the end. If you do have questions as the seminar progresses, please put them in the chat and message myself. So that's Julia or Carly Wright, who's also a team member for the Acer team as well. If you're able to message one of the hosts with any of your questions, we'll get to those towards the end of the event. And if you do have any issues, whether it's technical issues or anything else, any questions that you may have, please feel free to message one of us in the chat as well. If you'd like to hear this event today in French, we do have a live interpreter that is available to do live interpretation for us today. And so if you'd like to listen to the French interpretation, you can select the French interpretation option by looking at the bottom of your screen. You should see a globe that says interpretation. You can then select the French option and make sure to mute the original audio so that you only hear our French speaker. So I will pass things over to Ami from Dairy Farmers of Canada, who will do a brief introduction before we get into our main panel speakers today. So Ami, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Julia. So my name is Amy Desilets. I'm Assistant Director Research at Dairy Farmers of Canada. I first want to thank you all for registering for today's webinar. This is the first edition of a new webinar series launched by DFC just a couple of weeks ago as part of our ongoing commitments to research, communication, and knowledge transfer. This webinar series aims at showcasing the exciting work that is happening in dairy research across Canada. This initiative is possible thanks to the financial support of DFC and its partners. And also, I want to thank the research teams from across the country for their collaboration, and also Acer Consulting for organizing essentially everything. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to you again, Julia. Thank you.
Thanks, Ami. That's great. I'd like now to introduce Stephen Roach, who is the Principal Director and Consultant of Acer Consulting. He's also going to be our primary facilitator today. So I'll hand things over to you, Steve, to get things started.
Great, thanks, Julia, and welcome everyone. It's really exciting to see so many familiar names and faces joining us, and a bunch of new ones as well from across Canada and abroad. Really excited to bring to you two exciting speakers who, in most cases in the dairy world, need no introduction, although I'm going to provide one anyway. And beyond our conversation today, kick us off with a series of conversations, really trying to grab at the stories that our researchers across Canada and their research teams and producers and others folks in the industry are all helping to build around many different themes of high priority to the Canadian dairy industry. Today, we are going to take a bit of a unique approach, and each one of our virtual research showcase series will take a slightly different approach. Today, we're going to do more of a Q&A talk and open discussion with Dr. Dan Weary and Dr. Marina von Keyserlingk from the University of British Columbia. We want to celebrate and also dig into what's been 25 years of really solid and excellent research in animal welfare in a variety of different areas over that time. And so we thought this would be a neat opportunity to just really sit down and have a chat and learn a little bit about where Nina and Dan have come from, where they're at today, and what they see coming in the future. Beyond some questions that we've prepared to guide this discussion, we are very much interested in hearing what you think, what you have to say, and what questions you'd like to put forward as well. We are trying to keep this within an hour just to make it manageable for everyone. What we'd like to suggest that you do is any questions you have as you listen in or simply want to put forward to Dan and Nina, we ask that you put those in the chat. Those are going to come directly to one of our team members. We're going to curate those questions, and at the end, we're going to have time for Q&A, and we may call on you to ask your question live in front of everyone. If we don't, we are going to follow up and get some answers to those questions after the fact, and then we'll share that information as well as a recording for everyone who can share it that more broadly with their audience. So with that, again, you hopefully can see on your screen here myself, Dan and Nina. Dan, Nina, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have the chance to listen and learn a little bit about what you and your research teams have been up to. But first, welcome. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks very much for having us. What a pleasure and an honor to be starting this series off, and we're really grateful to Dairy Farmers of Canada for making this event happen.
And I echo, it really is an honor, and we're humbled that we are the first ones. And yeah, many thanks to Steve and Julia for organizing all this, but also to Dairy Farmers of Canada and the various provincial dairy organizations and other dairy related industries that have supported us over the last 20 to 25 years. It's been a journey.
Absolutely, and that's really what we do want to dig right into. So I think we'll jump right in. And again, for those of you listening and joining us, please chime in the chat with your comments. And again, we'll make sure we can bring those forward as we go. Dan, Nina, you're celebrating your 25th anniversary this year. First off, that's a huge feat. Congratulations. It does not come without a lot of hard work, a lot of flexibility, for lack of a better word, as things evolve, as things change, and some vision as well, and some serious research aptitude between the two of you, your partners, your students, and everyone else that's involved as well. It's quite an accomplishment. And I guess talk to us a little bit about, if you think back, what have you set out to ultimately achieve with this kind of research program? How did this journey of exploration into welfare change over time? Give me some sense of, what does 25 years worth of welfare research look like from your perspective before we dig into a little bit of what we found?
Well, I'm going to let Danny go first because he's officially been there 25 years. I've officially only been there, I think, 21. So,
well, thanks. Yeah. I'm also 6 months older than Nina, so I have to do these starting things off from time to time. So I guess the most important thing to say is that, yeah, we founded the program to improve the lives of animals and the people that care for them. And so in dairy context, that means the cows and the dairy farmers. And we put those things together intentionally because we want to try to find the win-win solutions, the kind of things that work well for the animals, the cows, and also we believe that the happy farmer is going to make for happy cows, and vice versa, I guess, Steve. So that's our sort of our mission. The way we do that has always been through research, but also through education and outreach. And maybe to say a quick word, especially about the education bit, because maybe we won't have a chance to talk too much about that in your later questions. And in some ways, maybe that's been the biggest accomplishment in our 25 years, is just all the dairy professionals we've trained. We get a lot of students. I mean, I can think of a million examples of students that come in, green as green. They've never been on a farm before. And then they start maybe with a summer job for us out at the dairy, and they learn to love to love cows in the dairy industry, and they also learn all about the science, and it's those professionals that we've trained that then come out as experts in farm animal welfare, in animal research, but also with a deep knowledge of the dairy industry that I think we're most proud of.
So just to riff off that a little bit, I think the other one thing that I would like to also highlight is our colleague, David Fraser. I mean, he was a big part of making all of this happen 25 years ago. I believe he was actually hired first, but Danny arrived first. And I came in 2001, and I think it was sort of David's vision originally was to bring these scientists together that ultimately we became very, very good friends. And I mean, those of you guys, you can't really see Dan without Nina or Nina without Dan, to the point that our students often refer to us as Dina, as Dan and Nina. But it's been this creation of an environment that I've been so humbled to be part of. It's putting the students at the front. And that's, we're university professors. We're hired to educate the next generations. And we've had this great privilege to be able to do that through the context of dairy in many of these cases. And so I just looking when Steve let in all of the students, it was so great to see so many of the names of students who had been through our program and who are sort of the next generation, who will be, as Dan said, we're getting up in years. And I think one of our greatest achievements are these students who, as I said, have done this work that then has been supported by the Dairy Farmers of Canada and the various organizations, the provincial organizations. And I mean, kudos to the BC dairy farmers who were there from the get-go, that we've been able to provide research to help guide practices moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful. It's nice to hear about a little bit of that journey, that philosophy, and sort of what brought you to initially set out on this sort of research journey. Things have unfolded over the years. You've taken, different looks at different topics, different conditions, pushed the boundaries in certain areas and tried to clarify others. Can you talk to us a little bit, Dan and Nina, about where have you focused your efforts in the last 5 or 6 years? And the reason for thinking around that time horizon is most notably the Dairy Research Cluster 3, which is invested in a number of areas, and some of that has been in your work to try and look at some high priority maybe that's the fairest term to look at, what kind of research do we need to support producers on the farm today, and also looking forward into the future to prepare producers or industry. What have been some of your focus areas?
So over the past 5 years, we sort of had 4 key themes. One has been around calf and heifer rearing, and this is something where we've actually been active in right from the beginning too, Stephen. And so key examples of that have been around calf feeding practices, especially around calf weaning, but also trying to get various types of group and pair housing systems to work, troubleshoot issues with that, and help farmers implement those kinds of systems. And another key area, again, an area that we've been working on recently, but as sort of long-term research goal, has been in terms of lameness, but health in general. But there's been a special focus on lameness, and one particular focus at more recent years has been really the sort of following the development of lameness cases and hopefully the resolution of lameness cases over time. We've also, both in the lameness and in health in general, been looking at finding clever ways of helping farmers better identify cases, and that's sometimes through automation. And third area has been around housing in general. So we've again done many years of research around cow comfort. But in terms of the housing and management, one sort of special recent area of focus has been also around handling, trying to help develop better handling methods to make that cow flow just work smoothly and easily for both the cow and the farmer. And then a final issue, and that's sort of a little bit of a tougher one to deal with sometimes, but really important that we stay on top of, is issues around pain and pain management, trying to find better ways of preventing pain associated with disc budding, for example. And some of our most recent work, we've also been looking at castration and how to provide better ways of mitigating pain for when farmers have to do that procedure as well.
I think just to sort of add a little bit to that, for people to understand that in each of these, like the industrial research chair, which funds much of the dairy cattle welfare work, is not, I mean, every 5 years it's been renewed. And I think we're the longest running chair in the country now, because we're now going in, or we're in our 5th cycle. One of the things is these areas of research are not, it's not that we did 5 different ones in the previous cycle and then now 5 new ones in this cycle. It really has been a 20-year evolution. And so if we just look at calf feeding practices, and I was saying to Dan earlier when we were just touching base, I was interviewed by a Dutch reporter this morning, because apparently the European Union is now considering making social housing a legal requirement. And she had been looking through the research and found that we were the first ones to start talking about social housing. Is that, it started, that whole line of research started 25 years ago. And it's been sort of this series of studies over time that we've been able to build on the previous cycle's research, that we now move forward, and we have, along with many, many others who have also started working in these areas, got a really strong body of research that, if you do want to move to feeding higher volumes of milk, and if you do want to embrace social housing, that we can provide some guidance on how to do that. And I've often said, in a way, the Dairy Farmers of Canada and the BC Dairy Association and the others, they took a big risk in funding us, because a lot of these issues were super contentious. But we're sort of your insurance policy in some ways, is we can develop these things. We can afford to make mistakes. Dan and I will still hopefully get paid next week or whenever, but that we can minimize the chances that if a farmer embraces something new, that at least they have some guidance. And so that's all of the areas they're building upon. This is not just a discrete area, it's building, and we're progressing and moving forward. And that's been the great thing about being funded for so long in this way.
Yeah, it's certainly exciting, that notion of being able to build a question and answer. I think most all of us that have been involved in research knows that we finish a study, we tend to have more questions than answers in most cases. And I guess that's, I think in particular, why getting a perspective from the two of you on looking back 5 years, 25 years, and trying to understand how that story's unfolded, I think is so valuable. And one of the areas maybe I want to spend a bit of time here on is Dan, you nicely laid out some of the core pillars of your more recent research program. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if maybe you can start us off, but the two of you share with us a little bit of what are those stories coming out in the context of your research under the umbrella of, say, calf and heifer rearing, or lameness detection, resolution, and dealing with recurring cases and so on. So Dan, do you want to just give us a little bit of a sneak peek into what's that story looking like as your research has unfolded on some of these topics? And then maybe Nina, you can chime in as well.
So Stephen, I mean, in a way, there's sort of a fifth overarching theme too. And that is, if you think about it, all applied research, all research in the animal sciences, in the veterinary sciences, it isn't worth a hill of beans unless somebody actually uses that research, right? We're doing that research not to entertain ourselves, but so that in our case, we can help farmers make better decisions. And so a key area of, I guess in their heart, every applied researcher knows that. And of course, we've had this advantage, as we talked about already. We've had this 25-year relationship with the dairy industry where, people will call us up, or we go to seminars, or we do events like this, and we hear people's feedback in terms of sort of what are the important issues, but it's also an opportunity for us to talk about the kinds of solutions that we've developed. But I think something which is a bit of an innovation that we've really been working on more recently is taking that element more seriously, and actually turning that into really a research theme on its own, where the goal becomes really to understand and to document the perspectives of the key stakeholders around, for example, identifying the important animal welfare issues, but also, and this is really important, also understanding what these stakeholders see as barriers to making the kinds of changes which might address some of these issues. And so let me give you a really sort of a practical example there, Stephen. For years, we've known, because, and of course it was probably, everybody in this call sees, they talk to your grandmother and they're going to ask about why we don't see more cows on pasture. So there's a common issue, this issue about pasture and how do we provide pasture for dairy cows. And of course that's a complicated issue in the Canadian context. One of the things that we found that I was initially surprised by was that actually many of our farmers also, if you ask them whether they think pasture access is important, they'll say, yeah, but it's often, that even though of course lots of farms in Canada are able to provide some outdoor access, for other farms that's difficult. And so an example of recent work, and this is work that's collaborative work that we're now doing with the University of Calgary, run by our former PhD student, now postdoc in Calgary, Anna-Marika Schmidt, has been looking at the kinds of barriers that farmers perceive in trying to provide different types of outdoor access, together with stories from other farmers that are doing different type of outdoor access, to also provide an opportunity for farmers to see different types of solutions to that kind of practice. Of course, every farm's different, and what works on one farm isn't going to necessarily work for another. But doing this process really from the ground up in a serious research kind of way documents those stories that provides, again, farmers a better basis to make decisions, maybe in this case cherry pick different elements that could work maybe in their situation.
So I guess just another example of what Danny was saying, and I think ultimately this comes down to where I think we have, as scientists, evolved, or however you want to call it, is, we're both trained as experimental scientists, one treatment versus the other treatment. And as time has gone on, I think in our heads, we have, understand that animal welfare is a socially mandated science. But what we initially didn't really think about was these stakeholders, and trying to improve things on farms, and also trying to, what are the next big issues coming down for, that the dairy industry has to think about. This is not a question about doing another experiment on a calf or another experiment on a cow. It's understanding these stakeholders. And including, where we've also done quite a bit of work, is looking at veterinary farmer communication. The veterinarians play such an important role when it comes to animal health on farms. And we had a PhD student, Katie Mills, who did a study where she interviewed the farmers about their transition cow management. And then she also interviewed their veterinarians about that. And one of the things that came out of that is that both of these stakeholders, key stakeholders and impacting the life of these dairy cows, use the word transition. The veterinarians used it in the context of the academic, 3 weeks before to 3 weeks after, and use this term. Farmers, the transition cow is when she is in this particular pen for however long she is in that pen. She only may be there for 3 days. And when she's in there, she's a transition cow. But when she moves, she's not. And so here was an example where I think our work has shown, and we've presented this also to veterinary communities, is that you need to actually talk and listen to your clients, and in order to get a more informed picture of what's happening on that farm. And so it's the bringing together of these things, which is, Steve, using your word, it's the knowledge transfer, right? It's bringing research to the farm, understanding the barriers, which includes talking to the individuals who are responsible for care.
And more, yeah, to your point too, more and more, just this interlinkage of so many different stakeholders, to use that term, in terms of the various actors that are playing a role on the farm and the outcomes that we see or evaluate and research. I wonder if it's worth maybe thinking for many of our farmers that are listening here, what are you seeing as some of the take-home messages that farmers really ought to know from some of your more recent research here under any of the pillars you've talked about, whether it's calf and heifer rearing lameness, some of the broad-based housing things you've talked about, or pain management? Are there any important elements here that the farmers listening, little nuggets that they can take away and think about in terms of application, or maybe just a conversation about where your research is going?
I can start off and with maybe just sort of a couple of the real tried and true messages, Stephen, and then maybe just sort of also sort of maybe just a thought or two on terms of just areas that we need to sort of keep the conversation going on more. In terms of the tried and true, I mean, this sort of comes back to sort of, you know, sort of the key accomplishments over maybe the whole period. But you think about things, so 25 years ago, I'm sure we sat down, or I'm sure at least since Nina's been here, we sat down, we said, you know, we're going to solve this cow lameness stuff. We haven't solved lameness. But, and this is sort of amazing when you think about it, we basically have solved the hawk legion issue. Now, I know you still see hawk legion sometimes on farms, but we know how to house cows now in a way that we can basically not have hawk legions, and we've made huge progress on that. And I think about even, you know, 10 years ago, how this was just everywhere. And I think that's something to be really proud of. I think as an industry, that how much progress we've made on that, and just that the housing methods to avoid hawk legions, that's just sort of, that's solved. And I guess another issue to me, which I think we should take real pride in, is I mean, I remember when we started this work on our own farm at UBC, you know, whatever, 20 years ago, this idea, it was just a common idea that if we feed calves more than about a gallon of milk a day, it's going to make them sick, it's going to kill them, they're going to get scours. And that was a real fear of our farm manager here when we started feeding calves more milk. You know, now I think almost everyone's just feeding more milk than we used to, and we see the benefits in our calves. The calves are bigger, healthier, they grow faster, and they're not hungry, you know. And so you think of the benefit there of just sort of walking into a nice quiet calf barn and seeing those bigger, healthier, faster growing calves. That's anyways, it's something that I think, again, we can take real pride in as an industry. In terms of sort of going forward, I mean, I think this is, to be honest, this is always a tricky thing for Nina and I, is we know that to be most useful for the dairy industry, we have to be working on the problems that are going to be in 10 or 15 years' time. Right now, those might be things we don't want to talk about. So, for example, when we first started working on disc budding, a lot of people didn't want to talk about it. It's like, you know, I mean, I've never met anyone who enjoys disc budding a calf. I've never met a dairy farmer who doesn't realize that disc budding without anesthetic causes pain. But it's not something they want to talk about. But because we were able to do the research, I think that allowed us to be in the position where we're in today, where this is just something we do now. We just do it with anesthetic, and as soon as you're doing it better, I've never met a farmer that wants to go back, that doesn't want to do it that way. But that's looking in hindsight. And so I think the challenge for us is we need to identify, well, what are going to be the disc budding with pain control kind of issues that we're going to have to deal with in 10 or 15 years. And for me, one of those obvious ones, the ones we just talked about, is pasture. Is we need to sort of pasture, some form of outdoor access. We need to start thinking creatively about how do we begin to do that. It's going to look differently for different farms, but we need to have that conversation as a dairy industry also about, you know, what is the kind of industry that we want, right? So those are tough decisions and tough discussions, but we hope to provide leadership with that and in terms of the research that we do.
I mean, I think Jenny and we've been used to, I mean, it's not, if I'm really honest, it hasn't always been easy playing that dance, right? And being at the leading edge. And I've often sort of said, you know, sometimes I know that there's been farmers that wish that we would fall into the Pacific Ocean and disappear, because we do push the limit sometimes. And I guess what I would like the farmers to understand is that we don't mean any disrespect by that. What we do is we take our job seriously, and we hope that we can provide some guidance to some of these issues that are coming. And in some of these cases, we need runtime. So we need to be able to start answering these questions. And it's not just one study or another. Everybody on the call knows that all food animal agriculture is under increased scrutiny today than it was yesterday, than it was the day before. And these issues are coming. So I was in Europe earlier this year, and I mean, the elephant in the room is cow-calf contact. It is a discussion that is coming. We are not saying that the dairy industry needs to transition to that tomorrow, but we feel that we need to at least be prepared to have those conversations. And they're not going to be easy. Change is always hard. So, back to Danny's example about pasture and disbudding, I remember being with a group of farmers, and we had just published this paper about cows being highly motivated to access pasture. And it had gotten a lot of media traction. And I mean, I get it. There was lots of farmers that were really upset and were, emotional about this. And I remember saying to the group of farmers, saying, look, 10 years ago, when we published some of the work on pain, a lot of people weren't happy. It didn't hit the media in the same way, but had it, what would have happened? And I remember another farmer in the room saying, we would have yelled at you. And now, as Dan said, this is, for most farms, this is just the thing that they do. They don't even question pain mitigation anymore. And so it's these conversations that need to happen. And with it also comes research questions that we can hopefully provide some guidance in the event that the industry needs to take a left or a right-hand turn.
I think those are some great examples and some ones that we're absolutely facing now. And to your point, and maybe we can touch on them briefly, some of the ones that we're seeing other areas. I think, again, most of us on the call appreciate we can look to Europe, for example, to see what, the writing on the wall in some cases, or at least some of the conversations we're going to be expecting to have here. Dan, you mentioned something that I just want to come back to in terms of trying to help inform the conversation and support the industry. You've had an important role here in some of the code of practice updates here. I wonder if it's just worth talking a little bit about how science and how many of our collective colleagues here in the research world, in particular in Canada, but abroad as well, how that gets factored into decisions around things like the code of practice.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the codes, of course, are industry-led. They're developed by our own dairy farmers around the table, with input from a number of experts, including, and the whole code process starts off actually with the scientific review, which pulls together all of the research on key topics that the code committee is looking for answers on. And so, for example, in the current revisions to the code, there's this suggestion of adding in pain relief for the post-operative pain that happens after disbudding, not just for the immediate pain during disbudding, but for the pain that happens in the hours after disbudding. Anybody who's had a burn injury will tell you, yeah, the pain, it hurts when you get burnt, but it hurts. The hurt doesn't stop, a minute as soon as you remove the iron. It's something that lasts for hours afterwards. To do that, there's been a large number of studies to find the right ways of doing it, the approaches that really work for the calf, but that also are really feasible and easy for the farmers. And we've been really proud to be part of some of that research. But yeah, that research gets compiled, and then the code committee looks at it, and it decides what to make as a recommendation. But again, this comes back to sort of a key element of what we do. we don't tell anyone what to do. What we want to do is we want to create the research that allows farmers to make better decisions. And in this case, this is the kind of research that goes into informing that science document that then basically allows the industry to decide, okay, are we ready to make this move? And if we do, what's the right recommendation to put in? And there's a bunch of elements of the code that we've been really pleased and proud to try to have provided that some of that research, as Nina says, sometimes that takes, it's not just one study, right, Stephen? You can't make a good recommendation on the basis of one study. You need to do that series of studies, often done actually in separate groups, that then provides this body of research that gives the industry the confidence to say, yeah, if we do this, it's really going to work. It's going to work for the animals. It's going to work for the farmers.
Just on the code, I remember during the first draft of the code, writing some sections for the scientist report. I'm only like 10 steps from Dan's office, right? So he comes down and says, I need help on these things. And so one of them was on feeding behavior, but also on stocking density. And I'm really proud of the Canadian dairy industry in the first version of the code to actually come out with a definitive requirement around stocking density. And I can tell you now that in the US, this is a huge problem for them because they've stayed silent on that. And as milk price falls in their open market or goes up, what do farmers do is they push more cows into the facilities. And I was talking with Nigel Cook from the vet school in Wisconsin, who has spent his life working on stocking density. And he's, the overstocking in the US is crazy. And so that was an issue that, the code dealt with in 2008. And now we're actually going to come down, at least if they stays in the draft. And I think the dairy industry should be proud of that. But that was based on science and informed by the work that we and others had done.
Yeah, that's great. And it's funny enough, I asked the code question and we just got a question at the same time asking about the code. So it was a good segue. I want to maybe bring that question in here a little bit because it just seems timely given our focus here. A couple of people have asked in the context of the code and we talk about calf housing. I can't think of a conversation I've had in the context of calf housing where we aren't having a debate over what's the science on social housing, paired housing, and what do we know about it. We don't have time in 10 minutes to distill all of those pieces, but it's become, of course, an important focal point in terms of where the code has positioned it. And for everyone on the call, if you haven't seen the draft code, which is still under review, but when it was sent out for public comment period, did talk about removing of tethering of calves within a certain time period. It was roughly 5 years. And then within 10 years, expecting for Canadian dairy farms to move towards a paired or social housed system. And there are some additional caveats that I'm really giving the high points there. But I wondered, Dan, Nina, thoughts on how does the science around calf housing, how has it led us to there, and any just quick comments on or thoughts on that piece?
Well, I mean, that was what my interview was this morning with this Dutch reporter, was on all of that. And the fact that, Europe is definitely moving in that process. I think it's great that it's at least discussed in the draft code. I'd be lying if I said that I wish it was sooner. I think the science is very clear to the benefits. I really encourage the code to, at least think about the steps that need to happen on farms to make social housing successful, such as feeding more milk, which is now designated in the code, but also that it should come with nipple feeding and things like that. Right now, at least when I read the draft, it stayed silent on the nipple feeding aspect. But we know from our own research that if you want to go to social housing, you first need to have these other things in place. I guess part of why I say that, it's something that the dairy industry really needs to continue to have conversations around is based on what we're seeing in Europe. So in the UK now, the equivalent red tractor stays silent on social housing, but it's a different system. So we have retailers who are buying direct from farm. So you'll have a Marks and Spencer farm, you'll have a Tesco farm, you'll have a Waitrose farm. They have, I think there's 5 of them now, Morrison's is another one, have put in place what they call the demand change, a process demand, in that they're not going to buy milk from your farm, from your cows, unless you're social housing calves. And so this is a big shift, you know, where, and I think it's the retailers, you know, are pushing. We don't have that system here, but you take that, you take the fact that Europe is thinking about it. I mean, I think the writing is on the wall. What we need to figure out is how to make this change, you know, over the next decade to be successful. And so my worry is, we know that there's a whole bunch of different management that comes into this, that if, you know, on December 31st, you're individually housing and January 1st, you're supposed to, it's probably going to be a rough transition. And of course, we're engaged in trying, you know, one of our desires is to do research to identify farmers who are already doing it, what are their stories, and help in terms of capturing these stories to help those that are a little bit more resistant or, you know, unsure about how this change will happen.
I'll just jump in with a couple more things there, Stephen. So he asked about the science. The science is
clear.
Super clear.
Yeah.
But, you know, to be fair, you know, again, this is often in research settings, we have the luxury of doing things, setting things up right from the beginning. We got, as Nina talked about earlier, you know, part of our job is to be able to make the mistakes at an early stage so we can troubleshoot things. And yeah, so a lot of the research trials have had the advantage of that. I think that, like in all these things, we need to respect that every farm is different, and getting the ways to make this work is going to be maybe a little bit different on different farms, and that's going to take time. I also think that we need, and this comes back to what what we were talking earlier about, sort of identifying these kind of barriers. I know for me, and I think for many people that work with calves, the worst thing you can do is go into the calf barn and find a dead calf or a bunch of sick calves. And so people are rightly, you know, afraid of that, and they, you know, they either have some experience themselves, or they've heard of other people that have had a bad experience. You know, put a big group of calves together and you have any problems in management, and all of a sudden you get a bunch of sick calves. And so we need to find sort of you know, in a way, I want to say baby steps to make it easier for people to succeed. This is one reason why we've done a lot of our work on just pair housing, Stephen. So, you know, basically just take an existing, even as an existing hutch, and all you do is you remove the fence between 2 hutches. And so you haven't changed anything in your management at all. All you've got is the calves are basically sharing twice the amount of space, and the calves have at least one other calf that can hang out with. It turns out something like that has huge benefits, but it has almost no risks in terms of the things we talked about. So, but I mean, you know, there's one example that might work again for one farmer, might not work for another because they might have another constraint. But I do think, and this is, to me, it's a challenge that an important research challenge for the next, I would say, 5 years for us as a Canadian industry, is to try to look on real farms, commercial farms, to see the kinds of challenges and success that different farmers are having in implementing different types of group housing. And then again, learn from that combination of stories and share those stories more widely for our industries.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We've got a couple of, this has stimulated a few folks on the question side, which is great. So I want to ask you about one thing, Nina, you mentioned, and the science has been quite clear on this success factor, which is volume and quality of milk feeding. The other piece is a common concern we hear from producers in the context of, hey, I'm being asked to go to social housing. What about cross-sucking? How big of an issue is this going to be? Those are not mutually exclusive. So I bring them or put them together a little bit for an opportunity for perhaps either of you to comment on, to maybe talk about what is one key area that's maybe going to help allay a concern that many have, and on the flip side, perhaps help realize some of the benefits the research is suggesting we can achieve by transitioning to this type of system.
Well, I think, what's super important here is to take the system apart and then slowly put it back together. I think what's happened too often is that there's been so much pressure to social housing that there is no talk about what are the pieces that you need to have in place to make it successful. And I mean, it was clear this morning in my conversation, this person said, look, I've talked to 10 different people about social housing, and not one person talked about the things that you talked about, which is before you even go there, make sure that you're nipple feeding, that the cat, and don't make the nipple hole really big, make it actually smaller. So they have to work really hard to suck because they're mammals, highly motivated to suck. And so we need to allow them to engage in that. And we also have to make sure that they're not hungry. Cross-sucking, in many cases, is a signal that they're super hungry. So make sure before you even go there, you know, feed calves through a nipple bottle, give them lots of milk, make sure that they're not hungry, and don't just give the nipple bottle and rip it away. Allow them to really engage in that behavior. And once that's all sorted out, then go to, as Danny said, the easiest thing to do is to go to pair housing. And because you've got all these other pieces in place already, then the chances of pair housing working is, I would say, 100-fold than if you just go from wherever you were. And I mean, I've talked to individuals who want to do the right thing, but are still bucket feeding. And, you know, when a calf gets, and limit feeding, getting milk, they go, they drink it all up, and then they suck on whatever they can suck on. And God forbid, if there's another calf, they suck on that. So it's taking these things apart. And I guess that's where I really encourage the code to actually, you know, make sure that whatever the language is in there that ultimately results in going to social housing, you have the pieces in place along the way so that farmers are not making 4 changes overnight.
Is there a, I'll be a bit tongue-in-cheek here, is there a magic minimum volume of milk we want to strive for? And I say this tongue-in-cheek because obviously there's lots of opinions, there's lots of research, there's also lots of decisions that have been made if we look globally at how other programs have established minimums, and whether those are quality assurance programs that have minimum standards, or on the flip side, try to set aspirational benchmarks for optimal outcomes. So any thoughts there? I know that's not an easy one to just draw a line in the sand, but any thoughts there?
I can jump in there.
Yeah.
You need to think of the real baby calf, like the calf between 0 and 4 weeks of age. The only nutrient it can make use of is milk. You can put solid feed in front of it, and it might dabble a little bit, it might play a little bit with it, but it's not getting really almost anything in terms of real nutrition from that. So if you want the calf to grow and to thrive and to have a functioning immune system and all those kinds of things we want of our calves, you got to give it milk. The truth is that our calves vary, right? Depends upon the breed of calves. It depends, even within a breed, it depends upon individuals. But there's lots of calves that I know and love, including many of the dairy center, that are happy to drink in that age range. In that very young calves are happy to be chugging back 10 liters of milk, sometimes 12 liters of milk. Now, might those calves still do just fine if we capped it at 8? Probably most of them would. I don't know. To me, and this is something that we've talked about, it feeds into the whole weaning issue, which actually I think is a way more interesting but more complex issue, Stephen. But I would say, if you have whatever your milk budget is, spend it on your calves when they're youngest, because that's all they can do is drink milk. And so from our perspective, what we try to do is just let the calves drink whatever they want in that first 4 weeks. And then as the calves start to get a little bit older, what we do is we ramp that milk down, because then the calves can start making use of calf starter and other feeds And then that also helps with weaning, because one challenge in terms of feeding calves more milk is really important. It allows those calves to thrive and to grow really well when they're babies. But the more you feed them, then the more difficult weaning can sometimes be once they get a little bit older. And so what we do is we often just try to throttle that milk back, so that you're basically taking that milk you would have spent maybe on the calf when she was 8 or 10 weeks old, and instead you spend it on her when she is 2 or 3 weeks old, when as I said, that's all she can use. So I think the thing to remember with milk feeding, especially that baby calf, is that is probably whatever you're feeding now plus 10% or 20%. But the calves will vary. Lots of calves are quite happy to drink 10 or more liters at that age.
Yeah, and I mean, what I've often said to farmers early on is, they tell me, look, I mean, I'm feeding 8 liters a day now because I heard that that's what I should be feeding. So you take your entire milk feeding period, whatever it is, 42 or 60 days, you times it by 8 liters a day, and then put at least, the first half of that into the first 3 or, even more than that into the first 60 or 70% into the first month. Because they can't eat starter during that time. And then we step them down at 4.5 weeks, nothing fast over 5 or 6 days. And then you just run them out at 6-7 liters, depending on what your feeding regime is. And then when you wean, again, nothing fast, reduce it slowly over 5 or 6 days. And so you're still ultimately using the same amount of milk that you did before. You're just allocating more of it to the front end when they can't eat anything else. I mean, I grew up in the beef industry. Those beef calves, there's a reason they gain, 1.2 kilos a day. It's because they're drinking 8 or 10, 12 liters a day early on.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate it. And I would sum that up and say the answer often is it depends. And there's so much other pieces that need to come into it, right? And that's true of most questions I've asked and many others that we collectively discuss. I keeping an eye on time, I want to throw one more question out there, which is one of the themes of your discussion, or of our discussion today, has been an eye towards the future, positioning research to try to provide some context and some level of understanding around issues that the industry may face or they may desire to go. How are you positioning your research moving forward here? And I guess to be more specific, what kind of topics do you see yourself really digging into to try and position industry to be more resilient, to be more prepared when it comes to future issues of priority when it comes in the context of welfare?
I can start with that. We've actually started thinking about that. I mean, the funding that we have right now ends in 2023, and we're starting to talk with our partners, including our Dairy Farmers of Canada and the various other partners that we have. And we actually had a get together a couple months, or maybe 3 or 4 months ago, where we basically had a bunch of focus groups with them on Zoom, and asking them sort of, where do they want us to go, and where do they think we should go? And of course, lots of things came up. Lots of things that, this is generally the dairy industry, and Dan and I are not experts in economics and some of these things, and Emmy and everybody else knows people that can do that sort of stuff. But what really, I think, my reason for saying that is we never really go forward without the industry. We do this collaboratively, and this was our doing that collaboratively. Where do we, they brought up, and we also agree, are things like climate change and animal welfare, the tension that is going to come in those realms. We see the animal handling continuing on. We see a lot of the themes, lameness has not gone away. It's still there, and we will hopefully, with our partners together, agree that that's something that we should still continue to do. Another big area, and we've talked about it quite a bit here, is this understanding barriers to adoption and the knowledge transfer aspect, and really using the farms as our research tools rather than doing all the work at the dairy center, is really incorporating the farmers and we thank all those farmers that have allowed our students to go onto their farms. But yeah, these are sort of the areas that we see going into. Of course, there's going to be lots of conversations around issues like cow-calf separation and what does this mean? What are the conversations are going to be like? We already know that this is going to be a highly contentious issue for the public, for the consumer, the people that you want to buy your product, find this one a hard one to swallow. But I think the other work that, and I guess this is how Dan and I are both cup half full type of people. The thoughtful person on the street doesn't expect the dairy industry to change overnight, but they do expect the dairy industry to get better every day. And those are two very different things. And so part of that is going to take courage to allow us to go into some of these areas that, the same as pain mitigation 20 years ago, that were scary. Our role is, as Dan said it, I've said it, is we are the ones that can do that research along with all the others, and we can afford to make the mistakes. As a dairy farmer, you can't afford to make a mistake. So those are things that we see the next sort of 5 to, given our age, the next 5 to maybe 10 years, but that's anything to add to that, Danny?
Beautifully said, yeah. Except the age bit.
Okay. You are a little bit older than I am, so I can see it.
Oh, rub it in. Well, I just keeping an eye on time. Dan, Nina, I do really want to thank you for taking the time to give us some insight into where you've been, where you are, and where you're headed. For everyone here listening, again, this is one of a long series of virtual showcase sessions we're going to be doing in different ways. I'm going to hand back to Julia Saracini, one of my colleagues, to briefly give you some insight into where we're headed next in terms of our topics. But Dan, Nina, thank you very much again for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us here. Please hang on for another minute or two just to see where we're headed next in terms of content. And for those of you that asked questions that we weren't able to get to, we will provide some offline response to that in addition to the link to this recording, so you can see and follow up a little bit more on those. Julia, back to you.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's able to join us today. This has also been recorded, so for those who weren't able to join or for those who only missed part of it, we'll be able to share the recording out afterwards. Thanks to Dan and Nina again for their contributions to today's webinar. If you guys would like to know more about what Dan and Nina are working on, we've linked their website in the chat for you all. And I also just wanted to make a mention of our next and upcoming webinar, which is upcoming on October 12th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. So same time as this one, it'll be featuring students and collaborators from Dr. Javier Sanchez and Dr. Luke Hyder's lab from the University of PEI. We've sent out registration emails for this one, but if you haven't received it, we'll send out a registration again next week, but make sure to register for this event. We'd love to have you all participate. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or anyone from the ACER consulting team. And thank you all again so much for attending. It was a pleasure to have you all today.